Hey everyone, welcome back to week 2 of the group theory seminar. I'm super excited about this week. This theory or infusion of theories to me speaks to my heart and soul as a clinician, as a human, and I find it immensely helpful to think of this as my style or approach that I'm working towards. So hopefully I can do this justice and kind of have you see why that is. Just as a reminder, the overview of these theory seminars, there's going to be a couple of sections, a brief inception or history of the theory, some core concepts related to the theory or approach, differences between this theory and interpersonal group therapy as we know it, and then taking a social justice or anti-racist frame, trying to infuse that in the content and the examples as I speak through that. So 2 main books are used as reference for this, as well as an article that I created to try and model this theory with the 75th anniversary vignette, since there was no Gestalt group therapy article for that, much less Buddhist Gestalt group therapy. And the 2 books that I would highly recommend you pick up and read both of them, because I think they both have really lovely and unique contributions. Interjections in Gestalt Group Therapy has a way of modernizing the Gestalt group approach, which traditionally Gestalt Group Therapy was kind of a individual therapy in the presence of others, hot seat kind of approach. And that really has shifted to a more relational, authentic stance. And it fuses so well with Buddhism or Buddhist psychology. Again, with Buddhism, it's not that you have to ascribe to the religious dogma or identify with that spiritual belief system to be able to agree with the concepts underlying Buddhist psychology. And so the Buddhist psychology Gestalt therapy integrated focuses more on an individual frame of how these things intertwine, and you can use these within your work. But I do my best, because I think both of these really speak to how I approach group therapy, in the fusion of these 2 styles. So definitely recommend both of these books, and they'll be the primary sources of the information that's cited throughout this PowerPoint. As a reminder, again, I want us to be cognizant of the sociocultural transference and context. I think this theory approaches that with some real subtlety, because a lot of what Buddhism and Gestalt work with is about being authentic to the phenomenon that arise within the group, and not taking that as something that should be or needs to change in that way. I do think that it's still important to recognize that you as a clinician need to take an active stance to highlight these counter narratives and belief. And as we'll talk about later, Gestalt therapy has a long history of anti-establishment social justice practices. So again, I think it really aligns with this theory. But if you notice any missed opportunities or misrepresentations, microaggressions, comments, I encourage you to email me. Still would love to continue to grow and learn in this process as well. So as we kind of focus on this split between Gestalt, group therapy, and Buddhism key concepts, I've just listed kind of an outline of some of the things that we'll cover in some sense throughout the PowerPoint. There's a plethora of material, and again, encourage individual readings on some of these topics for your own personal and professional growth. There's some really lovely books that I'll refer to throughout this that I highly recommend that you take a look into. But if we're thinking about the therapeutic goals from a Gestalt perspective, the idea is that increasing your awareness of your experience is itself the curative and growth producing factor, in a sense that paradoxical theory of change talks about when you can fully embrace and be aware of what you are, then you recognize what you're not, and you can have the choice to change. There's a metaphor that I like to use to describe this that I think, mention maybe in the next slide, but essentially the theory is, I think, pretty empowering in that individuals naturally want to flourish and self-regulate if they're fully aware of what's happening inside and around them. And because of the constraints of the systems that we navigate, oftentimes we create creative adjustments so that we cannot fully be aware or fully attend to our experience. So we kind of have some shared attention to processing content in this, and being able to voice your own like subjective internal truth narrative aloud to the group, as well as how you're impacted by that, is very important towards GGT's understanding. So for Buddhist psychology or Buddhism, like there is this need to be able to explore and discover what leads us to a sense of peace and well-being, as well as leads us away from that. And the metaphor that I like to use is to think of this like as Sonia Renee Taylor kind of puts in her book, The Body is Not an Apology, that when we're a baby, we're born, we're pretty great. Honestly, we think we're totally fine. We're acceptable, we're worthy of love, we're worthy of taking up space. We don't hate our bodies. We don't dislike another person's skin color. We don't have a fear of taking up too much space. We're not telling ourselves that we shouldn't feel angry, we shouldn't be scared. We're not afraid of having our needs be known and crying and asking for nourishment, love, being held by others. So think of that as the pure self, the part of you that comes out of the womb and is okay, is good enough, is worthy in that moment. That's you. Then you start to navigate the world and you grow up, and there begins to be all these strings that get attached to what was unconditional and now becomes conditional love or acceptance. We create these binaries like strings on a marionette, whether that's in your family or society or cultural expectations, in which you start to learn what is good in this binary and what is bad. What is okay for you to be or not okay in terms of the feelings, the thoughts, the behaviors. You need to look like this to be acceptable for someone to date you or to love you. You need to not express anger in public. You bring shame upon our family if you do that. You're not allowed to cry. Boys, men don't cry. They man up. These kinds of things pull at us, right? They make us dance and contort and jerk our bodies, our minds, our hearts in a way that is all for the sake of creatively adjusting to the system and environment that we're in. We want that love, we want the acceptance, we want to avoid suffering, because in this binary world, we're taught throughout our entire lives what is good and what is bad. And this happens all the time in groups. People say, I feel good and I feel bad. I feel terrible. And what does that mean? What are we coding when we say that? Good, I think, means happiness most of the time, maybe safety, comfort. Bad is every other feeling: sadness, anger, anxiety, disgust, envy, lust, jealousy. It puts us in a position in which we navigate the world wanting to naturalistically seek the comfort, the good, and avoid the bad. And that bad part of us, there was nothing wrong with that. Remember, we came out, we didn't have any qualms with being angry or having needs or expressing our sadness and anxiety and fear as a child, as a baby. So part of what we're doing, at least what I believe is the primary directive, is to break the binary of these emotional narratives that get crafted within our lives, within the cultural, social systems that we're in. And I say that by wanting to like highlight that string metaphor of a marionette. When I say break the binary, I mean recognizing the purposefulness of the emotions that we feel. Because if we're not allowed to feel angry, and I'll give an example, like in my groups that I run at NC State, oftentimes students will talk about this from the space of, I don't want to complain. And what is complaining but a word to say, I don't want to express anger, because expressing anger as a woman of color like is not acceptable. And so I don't want people to think I'm complaining. That's a way in which we find those words or messages that hinder expressing our authentic experience, our subjective authentic experience. So bringing curiosity, bringing acknowledgement, and shining awareness on that process is part of what we're seeking to do in this space. The idea of interbeing that Thich Nhat Hanh so eloquently puts in his book, and we'll refer to in different ways, is similar in some sense to field theory, or this sense of dependent origination in which we're all interreliant and interdependent on one another. That there's this idea of the self that's kind of reified in society and in psychology, in which we really focus on the individualistic sense of us as being the problem, us as needing to change who we are, instead of being able to hold ourselves and others in compassion that we are all doing the best that we can given the systems and given the ways in which we have to navigate those pulls by the strings attached to us. And that comes from this, the way in which we even use language, right? When we have a client come in, a person come in, they'll say things like, I'm depressed, I don't want to be sad anymore, I don't want to grieve, I don't I want to be happy. There's these ways in which we're kind of saying that I'm the problem, right? I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm not good enough. And part of that is like reimagining this idea of the self as being this like solid entity, like you yourself, again, are pure. But these systems that pull at you, they become internalized. We start to think of them as us, this solid self of us, instead of recognizing that if anybody was in this same space that I was in, they would be me and I would be them. So there isn't a bootstrap mentality where, you know what, with enough grit and hard work and motivation, like you can go through anything. When we say things like negative self-talk, there is no negative self-talk. We don't, negative self-talk, babies don't come out of the womb like, God, I am the worst baby. I cannot believe how terrible I am, right? We learn that from a system. We hear a parent say, you need to stop, you're too much, you're XYZ, and then we internalize that. That's negative system talk that pulls at us. So by being able to identify like that and seeing that in one another, like that we have these experiences, that these strings that are attached to us may also be attached to other people, and that we are interdependent on this, even within the group, we recreate these systems. We can kind of be more aware of these strings in one another, point them out for our awareness, and pull on it. Recognize where it comes from, what's the purposefulness of it, honor that. And then being able to pull on that can give us a little slack, can allow us the flexibility of choice now that we're aware of it, so that it doesn't have to guide us mindlessly to that automatic response that we're reenacting from our youth in the current moment. Interbeing, again, I think there's so much that I would want to say to that, but I'll spare us for the sake of time. Equanimity, a concept that I think is highly important and so powerful if you can really embrace this as a group leader, which is the idea of not having an expectation of any phenomenon that occurs within the group space. When I think about that in terms of life experiences, it's very difficult when everything that we do and navigate within these systems is set into a binary, right? Am I a good clinician? Like, did I do well, like with these people? And how do I know if they do well? Well, if they're less depressed, if they're less anxious. Well, is that the goal that we want? Are we feeding into this system that less anxiety and less depression for folks is the solution or cure to their suffering? Or are we trying to help them change their relationship to what those feelings are, to make them purposeful, acceptable, to understand where that is? And that, like, if someone has been oppressed by the systems because of racist behavior, microaggressions, systemic oppression, is the goal to like feign this happiness? Is it to try and express yourself and push them to be like, you need to stand up to your professor, you need to push back, where that may not be in their control. There may be systems that are like immovable by them alone, and by putting that onus of change on them as a like binary measure of their success. Did you do it? Did you change them, or did you not? That leads to more suffering, right? Rather than being able to accept that this is exactly what the system wants you to do. When they tell you these invalidating messages, when you as a person get told by your professors that your projects aren't good enough, your projects aren't worth our funding, attention, that system is trying to push that inadequacy into you, and that's not you. That isn't like your true self, but it makes sense that you feel that, and it's understandable, and we need to accept that that is where like we are in this process. So equanimity in terms of therapy can look like when we do an experiment, when we invite someone, or if we do any kind of intervention, that we don't hold an expectation with us, that there isn't an outcome that we need to cling on to, because the craving or the wanting for things to be in our control is so naturalistically there that it causes us more anxiety and fear, because we don't control and we can't control. And again, it's almost narcissistic to think like there's so many strings, an infinite number of strings and systems that have pulled people to creatively adjust and be where they are in the space, to react and act to your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors. For you to think, if I say this differently, or if I change this one thing, then that was the only reason why this took place. That's foolish and narcissistic, I think, to feel like we have that much control. We take things personally all the time, though, in these like dialogues on race and difficult conversations. Somebody gets angry at us, recognizing again that this isn't just the anger at us, but the anger of a lifetime of oppression and harm and hurt and sadness. So being able to approach that with a kind of hands-off approach is a fine balance, because again, I don't want it to seem like, you do whatever, nothing matters. But the idea that when we cling to this desired outcome, that is the part that is suffering. It's obviously that we're trying to be mindful and like skillful, but we are doing our best in that moment. And if we can embrace that equanimity, then I think it makes us suffer a lot less in this. So as I mentioned, like, just with that the idea of suffering is ignorance for attachment or impermanence, meaning the grasping, the craving, the clinging to experience, or the aversion from emotional experience, physical experience, what have you. That's what increases our suffering. And lastly, is this the way that we have freedom from suffering is through owning our authentic experience rather than wanting to reject it. There's the second arrow of suffering, which highlights a lesson from the Buddha, where he asks, if you got shot by an arrow, like, would you feel pain? And they say yes. It's like, okay, well, if you got shot by a second arrow, would you feel more pain? And they say, yeah, we would. So pain is inevitable. Like we all get shot with that first arrow. We all feel the disappointment of losing a loved one, the anger at somebody pushing our boundaries. But the second arrow is our reaction to our experience, right? I shouldn't feel angry. It's not acceptable for me to feel this way because of the ways that I've been raised and like brought up. Or like I shouldn't feel this grief anymore. I need to be over this. I need to move on. I need to be productive in this like process in this university. So focusing on and highlighting the second arrow of suffering in the group, we'll talk about like ways to do that. Now, these are just ways Gestalt therapy kind of speaks to positions that clients hold in group. It's just something helpful to be thinking of. If somebody's in a relational and contactful position, then they're opening themselves up to the pain that comes with connection. Because with connection, there comes grief and loss, right? There's that impermanence that things will come, they will go. There may be disappointment, there may be rejection, there may be any kinds of undesirable feelings, as well as like being able to make yourself in connection with someone's honesty and shared humanity and humility. That's really important and something that we're trying to work towards with each of the folks in group. The alienated contact or avoidant position is when we protect ourselves through those creative adjustments from the pain of avoiding intimacy and connection. Oftentimes I'll ask folks in the pre-group appointment, what's your relationship like with intimacy? Like, how is it modeled to you within your family? And what does it look like in your relationships now? How is it for you to give and receive intimacy? Whether that's admiration for someone else or if someone was admiring you, or if you were sexually or physically attracted to someone, like, would you be able to speak to that in this group? And what if someone was to do that to you? Wanting to recognize these experiences as naturalistic and also giving them permission and saying, like, if you feel angry, if you feel scared or objectified by someone's comments towards your physical appearance or towards their thoughts, that is acceptable as well and necessary for you to be able to own and voice. And as a clinician, as a white male, especially with my values, my stimulus values, it's important for me to bring curiosity and like, name my anxiety if something is spoken to so that it gives permission for folks to speak to that part of them. I think as a group leader, that's what we do in a lot of ways. We speak and we model so that we give permission for people to be able to own those, what seems unacceptable parts of themselves. Something as simple like in my group last week where a few people were talking in group and I noticed someone just kind of looking down, looking away, twiddling with something. And I know this person also has ADHD, as I do. So I was able to, connect with that. And I felt a little bored by the conversation as well. And so I just said, hey, Steve, you bored? And the response was an emphatic, like, no. Like, I am kind of bored. Like, I felt like you were connecting with me on that. And there was more permission for them to be able to say, like, yeah, I was a little, I can't really relate to this conversation. And so again, whether that's something as like benign or mundane as boredom, which can still be anxiety provoking to name, or anger or attraction or intimacy, done tactfully and mindfully, again, it gives people more consent to be able to name those experiences within the group. You want people to be able to highlight, again, any kind of polarity of their emotional experience within the present moment. And there's these positions that can take place in Gestalt group therapy that they talk about from an individualistic point of view, from a dyadic, and from a group as a whole level. Like, are we in this relational contact full position, or are we feeling alienated or avoidant in this space? And they also talk about the concept of fluid subgrouping, which is a nice like reference to systems-centered theory, which is another like helpful theory, I think, to conceptualize the idea that that the group is meshing well in some sense when one person can be in one subgroup and then the dialogue shifts. and clients can shift to different subgroups. So we're not consistently seeing the same like members making contact with one another in that. So at 2 levels in BGGT, like you can kind of look at the individual goals and group goals, integrating the polarities or paradoxes in oneself, right? Like I can want intimacy and connection with someone, and I can also be really afraid and like not want to lean towards them or to expose myself in that way. Both of those are okay to own and say in this. Enriching and expanding awareness of ourselves, achieving contact within ourselves, our authentic experience, and others. In Buddhist psychology, they talk about each of us has that divine self, which again I like to think is that purity when we're born as a child, like that we all start with that. And so when any of us make contact, there's something divine about that meeting, the meeting of 2 spirits, 2 like pure beings that can really make contact with one another. Defining one's boundaries with clarities in terms of like what you're wanting to make contact with or not. And again, that phenomenological approach, which is just being open to whatever phenomenon happened in the group, not having this expectation that there has to be a right way, binary way that things have to go, with equanimity, not having that expectation, and letting go of your own desires to be competent, to be good enough, because you are like inherently good enough, like holding on to that like as your core self as you navigate those dialogues. You know, when I talk about things like this, I'm reminded of a time in which I had committed a microaggression in group, and the sense of calm that I felt during it, which was novel, like to me in some ways. There was a white male in the group who was describing a altercation that he'd gotten in with a neighbor over having his dog move off the street and having the neighbor make some comment about the dog, derogatory comment, which really led that member to get angry, like speak to that person and yell at them. And there's kind of 2 poignant parts of the story. One is that this person was so aggravated and saw this person as villainous, and started yelling and escalating, and they were kind of shouting and cursing back and forth. Meanwhile, he and his wife were out with the dog, and so the wife was almost like pleading for him to keep moving. And this member has been working on being able to express his anger and not express his anger. He expresses anger quite a bit, but being able to increase curiosity and connectedness with others. So it became a point where he clicks, and something shifted in his mind as he described it to the group, where he started to be curious about what's behind the anger, recognizing again that anger is purposeful and speaks to something inner within us, some emotional sadness, anxiety, shame, pain in that way. And he started to ask, like insistently, like, why are you angry at me? What did I do that made you angry? And the person was still shouting, his neighbor, and took some time, but eventually was able to say, I'm angry because of all these difficult things happening like in my life, and you people not respecting like me or thinking you can own the place. And when he asked like what you people meant, he started to have the person disclose that he was a veteran, didn't feel like people really respected him as a veteran, and noticed that his dog that he was walking was sick, dying of cancer. And that swells of sadness for me to think about. But there was a shared humanity in that moment where the client the member was able to make contact with that person, see the part of him in him that he also has a dog that he loves, they were out walking with. He also feels a sadness and an anticipatory grief for the day of losing that dog and the impermanence of that like experience, and was able to walk away from that shaking hands with the person and having a meaningful moment where he was actually able to take a step back from his anger and rage. Now, that was one like really poignant and beautiful moment for him to like speak to, but it also led to a few members of color of different like backgrounds, a Black woman, a Hispanic, um, lesbian within the group, to speak to their experiences of shock and uh, surprise at him escalating that, and the privilege that he had to escalate that, saying things like, I would never think to do that. I would never feel safe enough to be able to express myself in that way, which was very meaningful for him to hear and be able to reflect on like what privilege he was sitting with in that like experience by having the flexibility to express his anger so uh, recklessly, you know, without fear of something happening to him. But also led to the Black woman in the group making a statement that, you know, my father would always tell me, is this worth going to jail for? And if it's not, then I'm not going to do it. I walk away. And upon like hearing that in the group, there was some other like brief dialogues that happened, and I brought back to the attention that statement to the group, trying to repeat it, and said, did anyone have any reactions to when I'll say Shamika like named the experience that her father stated that if it's not worth going back to jail for, then I'm not going to do it. And that led to the original white male member and the Black woman both like being surprised and saying like, what do you mean back to jail? She didn't say back to jail. And she kind of said like, yeah, why would you think that? And that in that moment like was something where I was struck with sadness, anxiety, frustration at myself and that at that moment. But I was okay, because I know, and I don't personalize anymore, the idea that I am somehow narcissistically the only person who could have navigated this system within the US without having the string of internalized racism be pulling at me in unconscious ways. And so I simply named to the group, yep, there's my internalized racism. I'm sad. I'm sad that it's there. I'm sad that I said that. And you know, now I'm curious, like Shamika, like as we're sitting here, because I imagine that was pretty frustrating and sad for you to hear from someone like me as the leader of this group. But your reaction seemed very like, you know, kind of light, and you were laughing. I wonder, could we explore what that meant for you? So by being able to not like have an expectation that I needed to be the competent one, or I needed to not have a racist part of me, that equanimity, I was able to attend to that person's experience and noticing like if there was something inauthentic or something that hadn't been expressed yet that was also her authentic experience. We were able to like learn and grow from that experience as a group, that gain insight to her being having to repress feelings of anger, having to make light of things to be able to be heard as a Black woman in the US. And the sadness around that, that we could all like make contact with as a group, and I could hear as a leader. That to me is like a beautiful, like few moments that really lead to the power of these kinds of moments of contact while holding a stance of equanimity. And so I think that's something I just really want to like instill in each of us. For the group goals, we're doing our best to highlight a culture where we can learn to ask clearly, directly for what we want, what we need. We're taught so much that we're not allowed to need. And even the word needy is so negativistic in its implication. Whereas again, like it's natural to have needs for respect, love, like attention, desire in that way. So being able to ask for that, even in this like mentality where oftentimes members will say like, well, I'm responsible for myself, and like I want to be fully responsible for my behavior. I'll often say that's totally fine. You can be fully responsible for yourself. That's actually all that you have control over is you in that sense. And you know, sometimes even not, like if we have our own brain chemistry and different things going on, that's a system that is not quite us as well. But if we're thinking like, okay, this is you, so let your needs be met, and nobody, we don't have to have an expectation again and that equanimous stance, that this person meets that need, but you can name it. You can name that want and need, and that is okay, like and necessary, right, in that space. Wanting to hold loving kindness for one another, that we're all here with the intent to speak to each other with care and compassion, even if we have to say something difficult, that it comes from a place of kindness and care. Anger, again, to me, can highlight a sense of somebody holding up a wound to you, and them saying like, here's my pain, here's my sadness, here's my sorrow, here's my struggle, and I'm showing this to you. Don't rub salt in it and throw it back at me, and don't push it away. Being able to hold that with compassion and acceptance is what many of us desire as we navigate through life. This I, thou part of us, again, is recognizing the parts of our past or present self in others, and being able to connect with that clearly, and being able to talk to one another, acknowledging that they represent this part of us, this part that they see that we were currently or are currently in some way. Again, leads to that sense of, I think, universality and connectedness. And being able to support and give energy by bearing witness to our pain and suffering. Not giving advice. Giving advice, again, is this idea of like changing and moving us away from our emotional experience. And so being able to highlight that for the group, and saying that although it's tempting, like rarely is advice ever the solution for the problem. And if it is the solution for this problem, it doesn't help us with the underlying experience that you're saying. It's not okay for you to stay sad. It's not okay for you to be anxious right now. Just do this breathing technique. Just talk to your professor, just XYZ, and you can get out of that. So I often say, like, rather than pulling this person out of the pit of sadness or anger or shame, why don't you see if you can sit next to them, like, and jump down into that. You know, Brene Brown makes that like a really nice metaphor for that, and saying, what experience are you connecting with? You know, if you need to pull them out so much, I wonder if there's something painful about the feeling of embarrassment for you that you could like connect with on them. That, again, I think is much more meaningful than any kind of advice that you can get in these spaces. Key principles of BGGT: holism, focusing on healing the self, the field around us, the constructions we make between the two that impact our action. I'm going to go through these a little bit quicker. Field theory and dependent origination, again, as I said, is like the isomorphy that whatever happens in the greater field, I say this in our pre-group appointments, like the racism, misogyny, homophobia, all those things, we don't want them to exist. We're not trying to recreate them. They're going to happen. And so when they do, I'm going to bring curiosity and attention to that, even if it's coming from me and I notice it. And I want us all to be cognizant of it. You know, whether that's like having a keyword like ouch, something like impacts you that we can like highlight and like almost sounding, inviting a bell to sound that kind of resonates, so that the group can be like, oh, we have something we need to attend to in this. That's important for us to have those dialogues and like honor the suffering and hardship that can come with those experiences for folks. And this figure formation process is really just like the attentional map of when something becomes figural, it becomes in our foreground. Like right now, in the front of my attention is this presentation, the stories and things that I want to say about this lovely theory that I want to embody. Like, and in my background, if I allowed myself to kind of wander a bit, I know that it's the morning time, and Sonia, like my 3-year-old daughter, will be getting up soon. And I am like cognizant that we're going to have some lovely Belgian waffles from this waffle maker I had gotten for Mother's Day, and so I'm feeling excited about that, and noticing my stomach kind of feeling a little light right now, and wanting to kind of fill that with some delicious honey and waffles, and all of that, as well as like sending this out in an email and wanting to like look towards that future excitement. That's all part of that figure information process, like the things that come to our conscious awareness and then fade to the background of our conscious awareness. And part of what Gestalt therapy like speaks to is like we need to attend to what's figural and not like repress it or push it, or else we're not going to be able to fully concentrate at it. You know, if we can't finish sending the email then we're not going to be able to pay attention to the person in front of us. You know, if we hold it here, we're still going to be glancing and looking at our phone. So try and resolve whatever emotion or state, like, and by resolve, I mean like more giving attention to and honoring holding that state, so that it feels that sense of heldness that we long for in a lot of ways, so that we can have that become more in the ground. And the pause in between that and the pauses in group, I think, can be very poignant at times when there seems to be a resolution or a finishing of a topic or piece, and allowing that to linger. I sometimes like to think of this as, again, there's an infinite amount of opportunities now that we've like entered into this like void, that we can start to like see what comes up for us and what becomes figural, and whenever that does for someone, to bring that into the room. So trying to help people get out of that fear of silence and anxiety in the group as well. Some key principles of Buddhist psychology, Buddhism, the metta, loving kindness and compassion, kind of spoke to before. This sympathetic joy is the idea that you experience happiness for someone else's happiness. Like you can really resonate and connect. Again, I love the interbeing, because again, it really speaks to this idea of interconnectedness, that I'm thrilled when people thrive. Like, when we think about our relationships to trainees or colleagues or loved ones, like we want to see them flourish, because those parts of them that flourish, that's part of what we want for ourselves, right? And if we are interconnected, then when they flourish, we flourish alongside them. It takes us away from that capitalistic, you know, top dog, underdog like mentality, which I really like, in terms of there not being a winner take all approach for these things, that we all are in community with one another, whether that's in suffering or in pleasure. So the impermanence, the unsatisfactoriness, and the not self are the three things that are kind of these truths, the noble truths that we need to work towards in Buddhism. And I really want to say, like, you know, impermanence, again, nothing lasts forever. The happy moments, the moments in which we're in good health, the moments when we're with our loved ones and partners, we will lose them. And that's a scary existential reality that all of us humans have to deal with, is that we will die, we will decay, we will lose the ones that we love, or we will lose contact with them by passing on ourselves. And that life is inherently suffering, which sounds really disempowering for folks. I know, like, initially it's just like, oh, man, God, suffering everywhere. Like I would just like, you know, to be happy and blissful, which I think is what some other like spiritual beliefs really like try to promise, in that is this eternal bliss as the end goal. But I think of it as really empowering in a lot of ways, because if I'm worried about leaving a relationship and I think, will I be happy if I leave this relationship? Will I make the wrong choice? Which happens all the time with folks in life. And, you know, happens in, I think, all of us when we're in a relationship with anyone for a certain amount of time. We have those thoughts, we have those beliefs or feelings or contemplation. But when we think of that in that binary, happiness or not happiness, then we suffer and nothing feels right. And as we get closer to one decision, we feel the pull and the suffering of all the things that will happen with the other. But if we start to think of this as like, I'm going to suffer no matter what. Like if I stay, then I may feel the doubt and anxiety of, could there be something better? I may feel frustrated when we have conflict over like money or other issues. I may feel like a sense of regret or sadness that things aren't the way that they were used to be when we first started our relationship. But if I leave, then I also feel suffering. I may be like fearful that I'm never going to find anyone as close as I was with this person, as close as I am. I worry that maybe there's something about myself that I could work on and that I could have, you know, sought to be more mindful of to make the relationship flourish, that I gave up too soon. You know, the sadness of having lost the connection and grief for what was good in the relationship over the years. And so it becomes less about like what's the right choice and really owning the experience of like, we suffer no matter what, And now I can focus on being more in touch with like, what do I need right now? And how can I own that experience? How can I be authentic to my needs with my partner, with myself, to say like, what is lacking or what do I desire in the other, like out there? And how can I say like, it's not about them being the answer to happiness, but about owning like, what does that represent? This Lacanian psychology kind of sense, there's a sense of like, what's the desire behind the demand? And that way you can kind of speak to that, and I think be more in touch with that authentically with your partner, with yourself, and see if that can be like met, that need can be met in that way. This idea of not self, I would just like to say one last story for this, and then I promise I'll go through these slides a lot quicker. When Sonia was about 2.5, and we came to this new place in North Carolina, what we often do in a bedtime routine is I go in the like snack closet, like with her. She gets something like to eat, like a small packet of something, and she turns off the light. We're in this new house, and closes the door as I get her milk. And so I, like again, want to highlight this example as a way of saying like, this is how we focus more on the self as to blame for these things, and can get caught up into that suffering mindset. One night, like I was fixing her milk, and I told her like, hey, Sonia, come on, turn off the light, close the door. And I turned myself away for the milk. And then when I turn back and I look at her, I see plastic bags on the ground. Looks like she's throwing plastic bags. And I immediately feel this surge of irritation and this anger and thoughts that she's not listening to me. Like, why is she doing this? Like, she needs to go to bed. Like, am I being like too loose or irresponsible as a parent? All these thoughts which make me like swell up with this energy and say, Sonia, you can't do that. You need to turn off the light. We need to go to bed. And then as I turn the corner and I feel this like shocked look in our face, I noticed that the light in which she had normally been able to switch, my wife had drilled in a plastic bag holder. And so it just gets me sad to think about. She was pulling the plastic bags out to try and reach for the light. And to me, that represents a metaphor for the ways in which we all navigate the world. The systems change and the systems impact us, and we're doing our best. But when we start to see each other as villainous, when we start to lose that sense of purity that this person, given their circumstances, given their sociocultural context, are doing their best, then we start getting caught up in our anger. We start losing that sense of humanity or compassion. And unlike adults who will find plenty of ways to creatively adjust to that shame or anger that somebody throws at them by being numb or by being pleasant or lighthearted or whatever, self-deprecating, Sonia has none of those right now. So she just cries and feels the sadness and like pain of like, I did something wrong, Dad's mad at me, which of course I felt that deep sadness for that transgression. I apologized. She forgave me. She had compassion for me in that moment. But it just really spoke to that idea of holding that purity of self and not taking it as the maliciousness that I think we often can assign to one another in this space. So the origin of suffering, again, is being responsible for the systems around us. Like another metaphor for this that I really like is we don't yell at the seedling for not flourishing in a drought, right? We often like think of ourselves though, and we blame ourselves and the people around us for the way that they act, the way that they think, the way that they feel, instead of recognizing that if I was them and brought up in that environment and lived in that way, I would be them. I would be acting like them. So recognizing that the system is the problem, not the person in front of it. It's easy to look at a pirate who abuses and kills a little girl to say, the pirate's the problem. If I had a gun and shot him, then that would be the end of it. But that doesn't end the suffering. The systems around us that recapitulate these oppressive racial inequities or these systems of misogyny and homophobia, those are the things that we need to focus on. How do we dismantle? How do we collect that? And I think, again, that happens in the groups too. We need to be cognizant of how the systems impact one another and the individuals in these spaces. So I mentioned the suffering before. Pain is inevitable, and then liberation and freedom is through the Eightfold Path. This is the Eightfold Path. I think it's just an interesting thing to look at, not necessarily that you have to hold it all in mind. There's a lot of lists in Buddhist psychology, but understanding the four truths, intending to live, learn, and grow and commit to walk with non-harm, non-violent communication, things like that, speaking without false, harsh, or maliciousness to others, intending to help, taking action to benefit yourselves and others rather than contributing harm, living with honesty, fairness, non-violence, effortfully notice and respond to your mind and its tendencies of avoidance, and mindfully attend to your present moment experiences and concentrate and sustain focus on specific objects, whether that's people, whether that's through meditation and focusing that concentration. That's your superpower in a lot of ways, is you being able to attend and make contact with others. You can only do that through having that focus. And as somebody with ADHD, this can be really hard, at times. So I feel for you and my neurodivergent folks out there. But also, I think I'm not a regular meditator, as much as this might feel like, oh, you should be. This is probably a key part of it. But again, I'm trying to hold that space that there isn't one set way in which to do this. And mindfulness and meditation, I think, can look very different. I can be very thoughtful and take time, but I don't sit on a pillow and do that for hours at a time. Not saying it's bad, and obviously I'm sure I will do that at some point in the future. But I also want to say that as a way of saying that you don't have to be so committed at every aspect of this to be able to still do this impactfully and effectively within yourself and within your work. Love listening to some audiobooks of Thich Nhat Hanh. I think that is my meditation in a lot of ways. Staying moment to moment in Gestalt groups are really important, in voicing your internal experiences. So some questions that you can ask: what are you experiencing right now? What's going on inside of you with the way that you're speaking? How are you experiencing these feelings of anxiety within your body right now? And who are you attempting to withdraw from in this moment? And how are you avoiding contact with these unpleasant feelings? Again, no feelings are negative. So when we say, I feel bad, no feelings are bad. They're all good. They're all adaptive. They all are necessary and authentic parts of ourselves. I often get chastised, at least in my old work, for having good and bad not be seen as feelings, but I really believe in that, because I do think that negativistic and positivistic evaluation of the feelings, that leads to the core of our suffering in a lot of ways, when we say we're not allowed to, or this is bad to have this experience. So this is a script that I think I got from AGPA a few years ago from, I think, Bruce Aaron, in one of the Gestalt process groups, that institutes that he had run. I think it's helpful, just as a way for you to, again, not to think of it as a robotic guide or script, but it's helpful if you're trying to frame this for yourself or for clients, being concrete with the impact that a behavior or action tells you, giving permission for you to not know, but to tell your subjective reality, and recognizing that can be a fantasy in a lot of ways. You say when you tell me there's a problem in our relationship, I tell myself the story, or I imagine we're thinking in extremes and exaggerating our problems. It makes me feel anxious and irritated. And I would say you could even speak about where you feel that in your body. And then I want to immediately counter and dismiss your point by highlighting a more balanced view. So if for me and my relationship, if my partner says we never spend time together, I will have this experience, feel like we spend some time together. Don't use that binary all or nothing language. And again, that puts me in this contentious place in that relationship. And if I can be mindful of my experience, my feelings, my thoughts, what my urges are, then I can approach that with grace and mindfulness in our relationship and make more contact with the pain or suffering that she's feeling in that moment, instead of trying to alleviate it and move away from it, which is very easy to do, not not something that's, you're going to be perfectionistic about. The here and now, again, similar to other theories, the emphasize to fully embody and appreciate the present experience. There are things in the there and then in the past that can obviously help influence your present experience and are important for you to be on the honor in this space. But there are many opportunities in Gestalt where we focus on bringing awareness and bringing change to our centered experience. And then there's a lot of good chances to work through unfinished business if there seems to be a present centered interaction that's based on some past harm or trauma, whether from that other member or like from a past experience. Empty chair and two chair like techniques can be like creative like experiments for you to take a there and then interaction and place it into the here and now, which I think is kind of interesting. I didn't really think of it that way. But if you're saying like, well, can you talk to your father like if he was there right now, you're kind of trying to make this more and more present focused, even though it's related to a past figure in our minds. So unfinished business, again, is like that unexpressed feelings, events, memories that linger in the background, clamor for competition. We're trying to like not make it figural, but it wants to be figural. And so it's like that phone on the side that's distracting you every few seconds. So if you don't identify them and you don't notice or acknowledge that it's there, it's going to interfere with your present centered awareness and effective functioning. And I like to think of this again from this attentional standpoint, like we don't attend to two things at once. We can split attention, like, right? We can like go back and forth with things, but by doing that, by having that lingering unfinished business, we're not as present. We can't make full contact with others. And as soon as we can recognize like, yeah, this is continuing to come up with me, even if it's like this test and this thing is that I'm dreading, it's like, well, like then that probably needs to come to this figural like place in the forefront for us to talk about the feelings and the like thoughts that you're associating with it, not just complaining about how annoying the professor is. I'm kind of like wanting to like redact that as I say it, because again, like I think it's actually great if you can own your anger. And I think when we say things like complaining, it can often put that negativistic view on like not allowed to feel anger. But the intellectualization, as opposed to being in touch with your emotional experience, I think is kind of what I'm more speaking to, rather than kind of just mindlessly talking about a narrative, really wanting to focus on how that impacts your experience in the here and now with your body and mind. So we encourage expressing feelings that haven't directly been expressed before. And so instead of talking group members out of their fear, we want to maybe like have each person, I think in my last dissertation process group, I had spoken about like, can we share what core or narrative string has been attached to us throughout our lives? And that would be things like, well, I'm never good enough, or I'm too much, like those kinds of things, which each of them were able to name for themselves and kind of bear witness to within the group. And that's something I'm sure will come up in different ways as we move forward. But staying with those uncomfortable feelings and even exaggerating them and the effect that they have on your body and like the depth of those experiences, I think can be really powerful in these spaces. Contact disturbances, I'll go through these quickly, but essentially if you want to be fully present in your environment, both to you and to the greater field around you, to other people, then you want to do that without losing your individuality in that space. You want to be aware, have your energy and fully express yourself. And we disturb that by doing all these kinds of like things to creatively adjust. Interjects are the idea that we absorb preconceived ideas and prejudices as our own. So if that's like, systemic racism that tells us like you are not enough and you like are lazy, and then you think of yourself as lazy, then again, I really get peeved at this as an ADHD neurodivergent person. Laziness does not exist. There is no cognitive choice where you're just thinking like, you know what I could do? I could study for 2 hours. I could work on this PowerPoint and finish it by tonight and then feel really great and accomplished. Or I could procrastinate and, play a game and, really feel ashamed and guilty that I'm recording this in the morning and worry about that cutting into my time at breakfast I'm going to go with number 2. 2 sounds fun. Like, we don't do that, right? There's a desire, there's a need, there's an emotional pull, maybe, that maybe it's like an inadequacy, that this isn't going to be good enough, or a fear about messing up the presentation or messing up the slides, or not rewriting the article well enough, thinking that I'm not a great writer. That all makes me want comfort, want care, and helps me like lean towards that. Like, I want to feel some competency. I'm going to play a game or do something that makes me feel that comfort and care. And again, like, we can say that's like part of that avoidance in some way, but at least acknowledging and being aware of that experience is helpful. So you see, I can see the avoided suffering that I'm doing at that moment. But like, absorbing those preconceived ideas that of being lazy is very like easier to take from the environment when you've been having that. And so being cognizant of the prejudices and the, like, for people of color, like racism can be and act in racist manners too. Like, that's not just a white focused thing, right? Like, white supremacy is systemic for everybody. So everybody internalizes those beliefs to some extent. Just being cognizant of that. Projection, taking a part of yourself and directing it towards others. Retroflection is when you're angry at somebody else, but you turn that towards yourself. I think that's like one of the least, as Aaron Black says, least mature ways of expressing anger is to point it inward, but very common. And again, if mom and dad are my caretakers, if they're right, if I need to creatively adjust so that they will give me the love and acceptance I need, then I am going to not be angry. I am going to think that this is my problem. I shouldn't feel angry. And that's, again, those binary strings that begin to get attached from early in life that we can lose sight of and not recognize that that pulls at us. Confluence is losing yourself by incorporating the environment or another person into reviews, kind of like merging with somebody else and losing your own independence in that. That's usually like manifested by group members just agreeing and talking in we's and like very us kind of speech, as opposed to owning their own individual experiences in contrast to other members. Or deflection, avoidance of contact through diversion, humor, lightheartedness, haha, trauma, it sucks. Just putting up that false image. And again, like, when we talk about these things, these are the creative adjustments. These are the adaptations. These are things that we honor. We don't shame or chastise somebody for doing. We don't tell them from a space of, this is not okay for you to do. Like, when someone uses self-deprecating humor, and some people are hilarious. I mean, I find it really hard because they're so humorous and lighthearted. And I know that there's suffering that covers up. And I know that that's the deflection. So I make note of it, but I don't do it in such a way. And if they say like, sorry, say, you have nothing to be sorry about. Like, if that's what you need in that moment, that's okay. Like, I just want to note so that we can bring more conscious awareness to what is happening in that moment of that space. So energies and blocks of energy, I think within the somatic sense, if we have unexpressed emotion, it can create blockage, physical tension in our neck, shortness of breath, not speaking, closed off body language. Our job is to transform that blocked energy into adaptive like behaviors. And I think by being able to name like and bring things figurally into our awareness, there's a healing there, like with ourselves or with one another, in which we can be able to transform that tension into relaxation, have it be heard, have it be honored and held in that way. The client sits in a closed posture, uncrosses their posture, and then examines what the feeling is somatically, what the emotion is that comes up, and crosses it again. You can kind of do those contrasting states so that you can see and be curious about the energy difference in that. So again, like as I've mentioned before, the self as a pure divine entity at birth who creatively adjusts the environmental systems. Making contact with ourselves allows us to have that compassion, awareness, growth, and empathy. And there's two types of self in Gestalt: the self-activating aspect, which talks about like chewing through the shoulds of society, culture, family to live authentically with us. And then the intimately connected self, which is empathy towards the contact and through shared vulnerability, mutuality, and openness with one another, which I think, again, can be so meaningful within these spaces to create that dialogue and make those true connections. Yeah, so for the group as a whole, like some interventions and things to keep into consideration is Being able to reflect on these group issues, if there's safety concerns, if there's unspoken rules or norms that we haven't explicitly named, but you might feel constrained by. Oftentimes, like a common one, if you don't set this up well at the beginning, is just the idea of waiting your turn completely for someone to finish speaking and never interjecting. So getting like that encouragement to interrupt, to act, like think less, act more in that sense, like to own that experience. If there's an elephant in the room, something dangerous of an issue in the group that we don't want to give attention to, encourage avoided feelings about the leader, that's anger or disappointment or sadness, embarrassment. Work towards a culture about talking about problems, challenges, and difficulties that we face, rather than feeling like you're not allowed to repeat or take up space for that issue because you've talked about it before. And then the Gestalt intervention of being not knowing and curious stance, similar to mentalization, so that you can, have that phenomenological approach to the dialogue. And then highlight how the group may assign roles to group members to carry feelings that other group members aren't owning. Like just something to make note of in terms of like who's only being seen as a part of themselves and not representing the more vulnerable parts of them and where those things may lie within the group. So the roles and functions of a leader, again, these all seem pretty familiar. Conscious awareness, contact, experimentation, engage through the use of self-disclosure to enhance relationships and create that mutuality within the group. Tactical self-disclosure, but things where, again, you say, like, when you, I mentioned it with my example earlier, I feel really sad. I feel like that, frustrated at myself that part of me, that racist string, like that, there it is, I see it. But being able to do that, I think, really owns that humility and openness to that process. So modeling that, disclosing your awareness, sharing your personal reactions to what you hear and observe in others, and creating this nurturing atmosphere so that you can really enhance the group's creativity and experiments and interventions can naturalistically emerge. Invite clients to engage in those exploratory experiments, to have refreshing emotional experiences, to see what occurs. Again, trying not to hold expectations that something will be new or happen necessarily, but holding, listening, and resonating with others. And that's really key, like not diverting and moving away from a difficult affectual experience. Intervening and proposing experiments connecting to that past and the current, the emotional suffering to the here and now. So the difference between this and interpersonal groups, well, there's focusing on acceptance of what is rather than the leader, members, or the group being the force for change or imposing change. Honoring everything in that way kind of recognizes the interbeing of our dependence, and like, to me, it's focusing on defusing this individualistic mindset towards the self. I think Thich Nhat Hanh was quoted as like, after somebody criticized Buddhism, is like, well, you're trying to like get rid of this idea of the self, and he's like, I don't need to get rid of an idea that doesn't exist. Like, that the self is very ephemeral when you really think about it. And there's all kinds of mindfulness meditations that can help practice that or lead to, that insight of the not self that I encourage you to look into. But again, like, if lots of things that you could speak to in terms of like, if you lost this part of you, would you be yourself? If you like where does the self begin and end, and where are the boundaries in that? I think is something that it's helpful to contemplate, to depersonalize the responsibility we feel towards ourselves and what we're supposed to control in this world and systems. Bringing interoceptive awareness to your body, and then, focusing on that interconnectedness with others. Again, the experiments in Gestalt that we'll talk about, they're all phenomenological, and we just approach them with equanimity so that we don't have an expectation of what happens. That's okay. Whatever is in that sense. And that's pretty much it for that. Provide a safe context for them to explore. And sometimes, again, that can be dramatizing a painful memory, imagining a dreaded encounter. Really, the sky's the limit with these experiments. So Gestalt, I think, gets very caricatured. It did for me, like, where it's like, oh, it's the empty chair, 2 chair, and that's it. Like, I don't know. But again, like, if you go into that thinking that I want an outcome for this, I want them to feel more sad, I want them to do this, then that's paradoxically not what the purpose and the theory would want you to do with that space, because you're holding that expectation in mind. Paying attention to language is really important. And with groups, often they talk in generalities, the it, the we, as opposed to saying I. You know how sometimes you don't feel like anybody cares and no one really talks to you when you really want attention, instead of saying, I sometimes feel like people don't care in here and I really want attention from others. Like that's difficult, but a really helpful reframe in terms of the pronouns that people use. Uh, I don't really know what it's like to go through this, but I hope this doesn't come off as harsh. Like using these kinds of qualifiers or disclaimers and trying to be curious again of the purposefulness of this. When people say things like, does that make sense at the end of a sentence? Like being curious about what that means or what purpose that has served for the person. Changing these can't statements, I can't assert myself, I can't talk about this trauma, to more of the empowered choice, like I don't want to right now. And again, I always have this approach that like you never have to talk about anything you don't want to. I want you to speak to the string, the emotional experience that's saying, I don't want to feel this, right? Like what's the avoidance, what's the pull, so that we can, because again, to me, that gets closer to our authentic emotional experience by saying like, it's the embarrassment that people are going to look at me differently, or it's the hopelessness that nothing is going to change if I say it and I'll be worse. Like, right? Or the anger at you, Vinny, for asking me how I feel for the 50th time. Like, you know, those are all things that are really helpful. That's all you need. And then, you know, again, not having this idea of you should or you ought to. There is nothing that you need to or ought to do, like in that way. Nonverbal cues that are incongruent, again, just to bring openness and curiosity to that. Recognizing again, and important to recognize your stimulus value, that like if you make a comment about somebody's nonverbal cues, that inherently it can feel critical based on your stimulus value, like, and what they're acknowledging. Like if I've commented on like a woman twirling her hair and that person having their own like criticisms or trauma with family members, with men, like feeling like they are always doing something wrong, became frustrated and became like shut down, sad because of that. And now I don't think I can mind read and necessarily know that. I could be more like attentive to how like I phrase things, but when I notice that, we want to bring again attention to it and honor that impact that I had. We want to hold that in that space. Same with like smiling, you know, again, there's a purposefulness to that and it's okay. So I often try to reassure people that like this is from a space of like shining the illuminating awareness to it, not a space of like wagging a finger at it. Like I said, experiments are focused on like being able to accept parts of one personality that maybe denied, and being able to focus on that polarities of personality and the functioning. So if we have like two paradoxes, one of us wants to stay, one of us wants to go. So we can bring attention to those fantasies, those internal splits. We can experiment with a diverse amount of fantasies in the group. And then rehearsal, which is just to say out loud what you're thinking silently. Just to, again, bring sharper awareness to the process, which I think is commonplace in a lot of things. So some BGGT interventions that I like often use and speak to, the idea of a second body. Thich Nhat Hanh speaks to this, and I really like it in terms of each of us like may feel drawn or connected to one another in this space. So if we each select a second body in the group, then we want to be attentive to our needs, our concerns, but also like shift at points to be in attunement with your second body and see what they're feeling and be curious about your experience if there's a need that's not being met, and just bring curiosity and attention to what you notice. Not that you have to know, because you can't mind read, you can't know, but that attunement and that like care, there's that web of connectedness and compassion that makes us a community where we're all looking out for one another in different ways. And I think when you have a group functioning well and people are expressing that like concern or noting the nonverbal and other behaviors with curiosity, then you've got a really well functioning like group or sangha in that way. Honoring the interconnected nature of suffering and happiness. I often talk to clients when there's a rupture, like there was somebody that made a homophobic comment in a group, and 3 other members became really irate and distraught. at that, because it like went specifically towards their identities within the LGBTQ like plus population. And so they like, kind of spoke to their pain, the hardship, the idea that they felt silenced and like pushed down their entire lives. And that moment of connectedness between them, as well as one member expressing anger in a way that he had never been able to express in the group, was a gift. Was, if we think of that as a garbage moment of tension and conflict, that became the fertilizer to nourish and to bloom something beautiful. And I really want to highlight that, and I name that to the group once there's been time to pass to kind of like have that resolve, or at least like become less figural, like in that, to bring attention to the purposefulness of suffering, because suffering is how we learn. When I feel shame at committing a microaggression, to me, we talk about doing the work with intergroup dialogues or with racial justice. And again, it speaks to this like capitalistic mindset. It's like, it's not work, it's love. We're going towards love and compassion and wanting to connect with those who are a part of us. And so when I feel shame, it's incredibly devastating to think there's a coworker of mine who has been going through racialized trauma and felt unheard and silenced, like she can't speak up to anything that's happening because she'll be dismissed or belittled or kind of just ignored in some ways. And if I contributed to that unknowingly, if I wasn't mindful of how I was playing into that, the shame that I feel, that speaks to my love and care for that person. I don't want to see that person suffer. I love that person. I want to, be there for them and embody that like non-harming like stance. And that shame's okay. It doesn't have to go anywhere. In fact, if it wasn't there, I wouldn't be caring, I wouldn't be loving to them. So thinking of that as your compass towards like your values, your emotions, as opposed to something that's like, I need to get rid of the shame. I can't feel this. This means that I'm going to be killed off or rejected. Oh God, I'm the bad racist one. That's something that I think is very antithetical to what we're working towards within this work. Highlighting the second arrow of suffering, again, that it's not your shame that's the problem, but your reaction to it, right? That are tied to these like narratives of what that means and how it speaks to other experiences in your life when you've had shame and been harmed. Increasing attention to the interbeing of connectedness, identifying with parts of ourselves and transferences with other people in the group and how they remind us or they connect to other people or maybe moments in our life. Self-disclosure, so that you highlight the awareness of the duality of emotional experiences and modeling equanimity. And then invitations to shift from this general interpersonal contact, like we said, to more specific directed emotional contact. I feel angry towards you. I feel the sadness about nervousness in myself, saying that. So being more present with that experience. Rupture and repair, something in Peter and Daisy's book, I think that they speak of is this idea of when you intimately expose yourself and make contact in Gestalt, ruptures and repairs naturally happen, being dropped, being interpreted, like misinterpreted, like in a different way, being overexposed when you feel like you share too much or you feel ashamed of something, being ignored by somebody, being coerced to pressured to do something, or being overprotected, and honoring that, owning the impact of that. Like, again, like, I don't think this is where we stop, right? Like, this often happens in the DEI work that we're talking about. It's like the goal here is not to just get real good at repairing and then never worry about like or never like be mindful of what are we doing to cause the ruptures, right? Ideally, we don't want to have these like ruptures occur in these kinds of spaces, and we're not holding that perfectionistic attitude. We know that the field and the systems that we live in holds that, and that will like occur within us and within the group, but we still move towards love in that. Social justice and radical compassion. I really think Gestalt like is such a great like frame for this. Pays attention to the client's view of the world and attends to the figural members out of their diverse backgrounds, their sociocultural context. This phenomenological attitude, you're less likely to impose your own values and cultural standards, if you can really lean into that. Thich Nhat Hanh, again, talks so well, and I believe the book Reconciliation, Healing the Inner Child, on this concept of non-discrimination. It's being like your hand, like putting up a painting with a nail and hammer, and when you strike your left hand with your right hand accidentally because you're not skillful, you're not mindful enough. What happens is you drop the hammer instinctively and you grab your left hand, soothing it. The right hand soothes it as if it was its own, because they are separate entities, but they are the same entity. They're both separate and interlaced, connected. So when one person suffers, we all suffer. We don't like have the left hand say, right hand, you've done me an injustice, give me the hammer, I want to strike you back. We don't have the right hand like say, like, left hand, you were in the wrong position, why did you do that? Or like, that's not my intention, left hand, I didn't mean to hit you, I was trying to hit the nail. You tend to it. And there's naturalistic compassion to hold and to honor and accept and like want to be there for the wound of another like it's our wound, because again, they are us in that way, which I just think is so poetic and beautiful to our experience as humans. So Gestalt therapy, again, I think has very much a great way of holding the context of folks in mind, and still something that takes a lot of intentionality and practice on your part. But taking that not-knowing stance, not making assumptions, not like imposing your worldview or values on them, and approaching them with respect, interest, compassion, and presence in that. And that's it. Thank you all so much for listening to that. I hope you enjoyed and were as invigorated by this talk as I am, because this is so life-fulfilling for me to speak to. So thank you all for your time, and I hope you enjoy the article that I tried to respond to for the vignette. I can do some more justice and give you some more concepts and things to consider. How does this look like in practice?